Okay, so what we're going to look at today, you guys looked at solving equations from models yesterday. We looked at zero pairs and how do I remove the ones, the positives, and then the negatives. And remember, the key there was also to make sure that whatever you do to one side of the equation, you do to the other. And that makes it balanced, right? We want to keep it balanced. And what we're going to look at today is what we call inverse operations. And we're going to look at what makes up an equation, right? We've talked about equation and we've thrown this word out there a lot. We've introduced the ideas of some of these. You've seen equations before and expressions, but let's go ahead and dive into the vocabulary of these components. All right, so what are the parts of an equation? A variable, coefficient, and constant are the three parts that are going to make up the equations we're going to work with here in 7th grade. As you can see here, if we didn't have the equal sign here, and then we would have an expression. But since we do have an equal sign, now we have a full equation here. And so we have a bunch of things, or not a bunch of things, some things that make up this equation. So a variable we talk about is the letter. So in this case, x is my letter, and that's going to be my variable. So a variable could be the letter A, it can be the letter C, it can be the letter Y, it can be the letter Z. Whatever letter you see in the equation is the variable for this equation. And that variable is going to is a letter that represents an unknown value or number. Right? That's what we're looking for. What can I put in there for x that makes the equation true? And we've looked at this already a little bit, right? We looked at, so what are some options? What are some numbers that I can substitute in for x? Multiply it by 3 and then add 6 to make it 12. And if you guys were using the substitution strategy, the answer here would be 2, right? Because 3 times 2 plus 6 equals 12, and 12 is equal to 12. The other vocabulary word we're introducing today is the coefficient. You can see here the numerical coefficient. We're just going to call it coefficient. And that number is going to be, the coefficient is the number that is going to cooperate with the variable. It's going to be the number that's either in front of it, or it's going to be the number that's going to be below it, depending on what operation is occurring. So if we see here 3x, we know that since I don't see a plus sign, minus sign, and it's not in a fraction form, this is actually multiplication. If we saw x over 3 in a fraction form, this would be division. You guys are only going to see one of two things. It's either going to be a coefficient that's multiplied by a variable or a variable that's divided by a coefficient. And so remember, the coefficient cooperates with the variable. It's the number with the letter. Okay. And then the last vocabulary word is going to be that constant. And the constant is going to be that number that's either going to be added or subtracted. So here we have an plus 6. And so that's our constant, one of our constants. And then also we have another constant that's actually going to be by itself behind the equal sign. So those are the quick rundown of some vocabulary. So from this point forward, and especially in this presentation, you're going to hear these words over and over again. What's the coefficient? I'm solving for the variable. What's the value for the variable that makes the equation true? How do I remove a constant of a plus 6? Okay, so get used to hearing this vocabulary, get used to using this vocabulary for the rest of this unit. All right, so real quick, let's identify the parts of these equations. So in the table, I want to fill out, well, what do I see? What do I know about this equation? And what I see about this equation is that I see that it has a variable of the letter x, right? We said that's going to be our variable here. So let me highlight it. Let's go with green. Okay, so our variable is the letter x. Now the coefficient, remember, is the number that's cooperating with the variable. It's the number that's either multiplied or dividing with the unknown variable. Okay, so right here I see 5 is with the x. So I know that is my coefficient. And then the last is the constants. Remember, it's either the number that's being added or subtracted, and it's the number that's going to be behind itself in the equal sign. So I actually have two constants here. I have a positive 6. And yes, I said positive, not plus, right? Because that's important. R, it's plus 6, right? We know it's positive, so let me highlight it. Let's go with orange. 6. And we have this number over here by itself, which is 22. Negative 22, excuse me. So we've broken down this vocabulary, right? So like I said, again, get comfortable with it, right? If you're not sure, ask a question. What do you mean by coefficient? What do you mean by constants? Why is there more than one, right? So it's important because now when we can start going to solve these equations here in a minute, we're going to refer to them. Okay, so let's look at another example. Again, identify the parts of an equation. So the first thing I'm looking for is the variable. what's the letter? What's the letter that's representing the unknown value? And in this case, I actually see the letter D. Remember, it doesn't always have to be X. X is very common, but it doesn't have to be, right? It's a letter. There's letter D. Coefficient is a number that's with the variable, right? It's cooperating with the variable. So in this case, we see a fraction, which means that we're going to have a division problem here. So basically, I'm going to ask is, well, what is D being divided by, right? What's the letter D being divided by? And in this case, we see that below it is the -5. The last thing I'm looking for are the constants in this problem. Remember, the constants are the numbers that are either being added or subtracted with the coefficient and the variable, or the number by itself. So in this case, I see here I have a -22 as one of my constants, and I have a -3 as well. These are the parts of an equation that you guys will have to identify, because when we start to go solving and we start referring to the vocabulary, it's going to be important. All right, so let's talk about how are we going to solve these using, I'm not using pictures and I'm not using substitution, what we call inverse operations. So let's spend some time just talking about what are inverse operations. So the word inverse means to do the opposite, right? So what would be the inverse or the opposite of each operation? So I want to undo what's been done. So if I see addition, what would be the opposite of addition? And we would know that that's actually subtraction, right? If I'm doing the opposite, if I'm not adding, I'm subtracting. So I want to do the opposite of that. So the opposite of subtraction then would be, well, if I'm not going to subtract, I'm going to add, right? That's the opposite. Multiplying and dividing also have inverse operations. So we can actually talk about how do we undo multiplication. So when we're talking about undoing multiplication, we're going to look at, well, what's the opposite of multiply? And the opposite of multiply is to divide something. And then the opposite of divide is to multiply. And that's important because when we undo it, so for example, if I had 10 plus 5 equals 15, well, I can go backwards, right? And I can say 15 minus 5 is 10. That's the inverse. Same can be said for 6 times 5 is 30. I can do the opposite and say 30 divided by 5 is 6. Okay, so there's just different ways of looking at inverse, some examples. Those are going to be really, really important for this next step. So remember these inverse operations. So the first thing we're going to do is look at this equation. 5 times some number x plus 6 is going to be equal to 46. So if I asked you to identify variable of x, coefficient of 5, and constants of plus 6 and 46, we're going to actually look at now, how do I solve for this unknown value, right? So the first thing I want to do, though, is spend some time to talk about what operations do we see. Well, the first thing I see, and it's obvious, is I see addition. Getting to my inverse operations, how do I undo addition? If we go back and look at our table here, the opposite of addition is subtraction. So I'm going to undo this addition by using the inverse of addition. And all right, so the other operation I see is this 5x, right? It's sandwiched together, and we've talked about this a lot, right? What does 5x truly mean? And 5x truly means 5 times some number. So I do see multiplication here. So I want to use the inverse to undo the multiplication. So let's go back to the table and say, okay, what's the inverse? Oh, multiply. The inverse is to divide. So I know I'm going to undo the multiplication. But notice we haven't even started solving yet, right? We looked at some vocabulary. We looked at inverse operations. We looked at identifying the operations that are occurring and then thinking, okay, well, if I know I'm adding, then how do I undo addition? And then if I know I'm multiplying, what am I going to have to do to undo that? Because ultimately, we're going to completely unzip this equation and undo it all the way down to x to see if we can figure out what the value of x is to make the left side into 46. So another example here. So what operations do we see? So I see a variable of the letter D. I see a coefficient of -5. I see a constant of -22 and a constant of -3. So I'm going to look at, Okay, so I see this minus 22, right? And so in other words, it's saying minus is also saying I'm going to subtract, right? See a subtraction of 22. So if I know that I'm going to subtract, what I want to know is, okay, how do I undo subtraction? So if we're not sure, we can always refer to our chart. And the opposite of subtraction here is going to be addition. Under this minus 22, I'm going to have to add. Okay, so we'll talk about what do we add. We'll talk about that here in a second. Okay. The last one is to see this letter D over negative 5. Right? And we know that if we're something in the fraction form, we really have to think about what operation is occurring there. And anytime we see anything in a fractional form, the operation that is representing is actually going to be division. So I want to undo division, right? And to figure out how do I undo it? And that's going to be multiplying. So if I have 10 over 5 equals 2, right? 10 divided by 5 equals 2. The reverse would be, well, 2 times what gives me 10? And in this case, we would say 5 because we know that 2 times 5 equals 10. So going back to my chart, I want to look at, okay, so if I have division, how do I undo it? And it's going to be multiply. So going back to talking about why is it that I'm talking about these columns are our steps in solving. So when we solve this problem here in a second, the first thing I'm going to do is subtract. The second thing I'm going to do is divide. So the main thing we got to figure out then is, well, subtract what, divide by what, okay? And so when we look at these steps, we're going to do some fill in the blank, drag and drop to get us into the right step. So here are the steps that you need to use to solve a two-step equation with one variable, to get to x to make the equation true. So in this case, the first thing you want to do is draw a line, and here's why. In order to remain balanced, if I manipulate or I move or I change something on one side of the equal sign, I have to do the exact same on the other. So the line really helps you keep like organization of your thought process. Right? So the first thing we want to do, if we go back to our table here, was to subtract. All right, we see addition, we want to do subtraction. And we know we're going to do some division because I see multiplication. The main thing you have to understand is the first thing we want to do is remove this constant. Remember, here's that vocabulary word, right? What is a constant? Well, let's go back and look. What is a constant? So if I go all the way back up here to what this is, a constant is that number that's being added or subtracted with the coefficient and variable. Also the number by itself behind the equal sign, right? So I want to get rid of this guy first. So if I go back down and look at my equation, well, the constant here is 6, right? If we go back to our identification, we said the constant was 6, so I want to remove the 6 first. So how do I undo addition? Well, we said, oh yeah, we undo addition by subtracting 6. Well, 6 minus 6 is going to give me the value of 0. So we can cancel this out, right? Because we talked about 0 pairs yesterday, and we said that when we have a 0 pair, they are eliminated because they're equal to 0. But whatever I do to one side, right, to remain balanced, I have to do the other. So I'm going to come over here and say, okay, if I subtract 6 from the left, I have to subtract 6 from the right. So now I can do a little bit of math. What is 46 minus 6? Well, I know that's 40. So I haven't done anything with this 5x yet. So I'm just going to leave him alone and let him drop straight down because we haven't done anything yet. So I know now that 5x's are equal to 40. What I want to know is how much is 1x worth. That's what we're looking for here. In a better spot. Last chance. Good enough. So what I want to know is how can I figure out the value of one of these x's? If 4 of them are worth, or excuse me, 5 of them are worth 40, how can I figure it out? Now, some of you may already see it by substitution, right? You're thinking in your mind, okay, 5, 10, 15, 20, and you're counting. Or you're thinking in your mind, okay, 5 times what gives me 40? Okay, and that's kind of the basis of inverse operations. So now we're kind of trying to take some of the guesswork out of it. And so if we go back to what I looked at, right? I know that I have some multiplication, so I undo it by division. But what do I divide by? So let's look at our steps. So step 1, we drew a line. Step 2, we removed the constant by our inverse operations. by subtracting here. Then the last one is we're going to remove the coefficient. Okay, so if we go back to our vocabulary, the coefficient here is the number that's cooperating with the variable, and in this case, the coefficient here is 5. So I want to remove the 5 by using inverse operations. And we know that 5x means 5 times x. So to undo multiplication, we have to divide, and I'm going to divide each side by that number that is the coefficient, and in this case 5. Remember, whatever I do to one side, I have to do the other. And we know 40 divided by 5 gives me a value of 8. So my answer is x equals 8. So we can always check it. We could plug it in. If I came up here and I typed in 8, and so order operation says to do multiplication first. So 5 times 8 would give me 40. 40 plus 6 is 46, and we're balanced. All right, so let's look at one more example. And in this case, I don't want you guys to really worry about the moving part, right? We looked at the moving part. I just want to talk about what steps you would take. And then you guys can work on the math with your practice. So I want to know, what would we do first? And if we go back and think about this, well, obviously the first thing I said we would do is draw a line. Okay, so let's say that our line is here. Say we did our line, and now we're ready to start solving. So I want to know the first thing we would do. And in this case, first you would, or I would if I was solving, is remove the constant. In this case, it is going to be by adding 18, remember, to capitalize both sides. Remember, we want to keep equality, right? We want to keep balance. Whatever I do, want to do on the other. So after we move that, okay, we get some number. The next thing I would do is, after I find what negative 3 plus 18 is, which is positive 15, not 21. I got to undo this letter D divided by 5. All right, so we want to think about what is, so some number divided by 5 is going to give me a positive 15. I'm not sure what it is. I could guess and check. That's one way, right? We talk about substitution. Or we can use the power of inverse operations. So then I have to think, okay, if it's letter D divided by 5, how do I undo division? Oh, yeah, the opposite of division is to multiply by the coefficient, in this case, of the number 5. Let's pull that right. Okay. In this case, what you guys would get is 15 times 5, which gives me a total, or excuse me, a product of 75. I do 75 divided by 5, that gives me 15. 15 minus 18 would come out to negative 3, and we're balanced. All right, so what you guys are going to go do now is look at a practice very similar to what we did here with the drag and drop. And you guys are going to drop the steps that you think you have to do using inverse operations. So as a quick review, what we did. So vocabulary, we have a variable. We have a number that cooperates as the coefficient with the variable. So it can either be multiplication or division. And then we have a constant. And so what we need to do is determine, okay, what is these? Because in order to understand the inverse operation steps, you need to understand what each part is, right? And then we have inverse operations. So if I have addition, I undo it with subtraction. If I have subtraction, the inverse is addition. Multiplication is undone with division, and division, the inverse is multiplication. And then the last big concept is, when you're solving these and you're using inverse operations, you draw the line, and then you want to remove the constant first. So we're looking for the addition or subtraction first, and I want to do the opposite. So if I see addition, I'm subtracting from both sides. If I see subtraction, I'm adding to both sides. Then the last step is to remove the coefficient by either multiplying or dividing, depending on what's already being done, right? We want to undo it. We see it, that's great, we want to undo it. All right, so good luck on your practice. Let your teacher know if you have any questions. Like I said, good luck, and we'll talk to you guys soon.